The world had ended, and in its wake, shadows moved, twisted, relentless, and hungry. Ethan Williams, once a dedicated paramedic, had long given up on calling for help. There was no one left. The infected had taken over, a devastating plague that turned people into monsters, leaving nothing but chaos and destruction. Cities were empty, the air thick with the stench of decay, and the sky seemed perpetually overcast, as if the heavens themselves had abandoned humanity. Ethan's small group of survivors had managed to hold out for a while. They scavenged through what remained of old supermarkets, hotels, and abandoned houses, always on edge. But it was getting harder. The world outside had become a maze of danger, and trust was a luxury no one could afford anymore. Ethan had learned that the hard way when his closest friend, Alex, had been bitten, and the group had to make a brutal decision. Ethan and his companions, Sarah, a tough former military officer, and Daniel, a quiet but resourceful engineer, had been holed up in a half-destroyed apartment building for the last month. The building was high enough that they could see the occasional movement of shadows in the streets below, but they hadn't ventured out in days. The fear of the infected catching wind of their scent kept them glued to their small corner of the world. Ethan was the unofficial leader, though he never liked the title. He was just doing what needed to be done, but even he knew that their situation was growing desperate. The world outside wasn't what it used to be. There were no more roads bustling with cars, no more stores lined with goods, no more children laughing in the streets. All that was left were the ruins. Ethan sometimes wondered if the infection had been some kind of twisted reckoning, a punishment for the failures of society. But that kind of thinking didn't help anyone. It didn't put food on the table or keep the infected away from their front door. "I heard something," Sarah's voice broke through the silence as she leaned closer to the window, her hand gripping the rusted metal of the frame. "Down by the old church." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had heard nothing, but Sarah's instincts were usually spot on. The infected had been attracted to noise, movement, and they'd learned to be patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their prey to make a mistake. Sarah had spotted them before, and it had saved their lives. "Should we check it out?" Daniel asked from the corner, his voice low but steady. He was always the cautious one, preferring to wait for the storm to pass before taking action. But even he knew that time was running out. They couldn't stay holed up forever. The resources they had scavenged were dwindling. Ethan took a deep breath, running his hand through his messy hair. The decision weighed heavily on him. Leaving the building wasn't an option, they had fought tooth and nail to secure it. But if the infected were close to the church, it meant that the risk was even greater than they realized. Every moment they stayed still, the chances of being discovered grew higher. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We can't wait here for the end." Sarah nodded, her expression hardening. She was ready. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed hesitant, but he understood. If they didn't act now, they might not have another chance. They gathered their weapons, rusted but functional, and made their way to the stairs, trying to keep their movements silent. The building creaked and groaned beneath their feet, as though it, too, was afraid of the approaching danger. But they had no choice but to move forward. The shadows were closing in, and there was still a chance to survive, if only for a little longer. As they descended the stairs, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Something more than the infected. A deeper, more insidious presence lurking in the dark corners of this dead world. The air grew colder as they made their way through the decaying hallways of the apartment building, the flickering light from a single, dying flashlight casting long shadows across the cracked walls. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to focus on the task at hand, getting to the church and back, ideally without encountering any of the infected. But with every step, the nagging sensation that they were being watched only grew stronger. "Do you hear that?" Daniel whispered, his voice strained, as they reached the building's exit. Ethan paused, listening intently. For a moment, all he could hear was the distant sound of wind rattling through the broken windows and the pounding of his own heartbeat. Then, faintly, almost imperceptible, a low growl echoed through the stairwell. The sound sent a chill down his spine. It was too far to be one of the infected, but it wasn't the wind either. Something's not right, Sarah muttered under her breath. Her eyes narrowed, her hand tightening on the grip of her rifle. She had the instincts of a predator, and right now, those instincts were telling her they were not alone. The door to the street was only a few feet away, but the street itself was an alien landscape, overgrown with weeds, littered with debris, and darkened by the setting sun. They couldn't afford to hesitate. The infected were drawn to noise, and if they didn't move fast, it wouldn't matter how many weapons they had. Ethan pushed open the door, and they stepped out into the night. The air was thick with the smell of rot, but there was no time to dwell on it. The church was visible down the street, its silhouette looming against the dark sky, a reminder of a time when faith had meant something. Now, it was just another landmark in a world stripped of meaning. They moved swiftly, keeping close to the shadows, making sure every step was calculated. But as they neared the church, Ethan noticed something. There was no sign of movement, no low moans, no shuffling of feet. The street was eerily quiet, a stillness that felt unnatural. "Why aren't they here?" Ethan whispered. The question hung in the air, unanswered. There should have been infected swarming this area by now, drawn by the scent of human presence. Yet, it felt as if they had walked into an empty world. Sarah stopped abruptly, her hand shooting out to grab Ethan's arm. "We're not alone," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan spun around, scanning the street behind them. There was nothing. No infected, no sign of movement. But then, he saw it, a shadow, flitting across the street, vanishing behind an overturned car. It was too fast to be one of the infected. And it didn't belong to a human. Before he could react, a sound broke the silence, a voice, soft and almost melodic, carried by the wind. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan froze. The voice was calm, controlled, but there was an undeniable edge of danger to it. It wasn't Sarah, Daniel, or anyone he recognized. He couldn't pinpoint where it had come from, but it had been close. "We should go back," Sarah said, her tone low but firm. She was always the first to sense danger, and right now, her instincts were screaming at her to turn around. But Ethan was torn. They had come so far, and the church might hold the answers they were searching for. But this felt wrong. Too wrong. "Stay sharp," Ethan muttered, motioning for them to keep moving. But as they neared the church's entrance, something shifted in the air, a sense of foreboding that was impossible to ignore. They weren't just being hunted by the infected. They were being watched by something far darker, something that thrived in the shadows. The door to the church creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. But Ethan could feel it, the presence, growing stronger with every breath. This was no longer a simple fight for survival. They had entered a place where even the dead were afraid. The air inside the church was thick with dust and the faint odor of mildew. The heavy wooden door creaked to a close behind them, sealing them off from whatever lay beyond. Ethan took a cautious step forward, the dim light from their flashlights casting unsettling shadows against the tall, cracked walls. The once sacred space now felt like a tomb, abandoned and forgotten by the world. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah muttered again, her voice tense. Her hand gripped her rifle tighter, as if expecting something to lunge out from the darkness at any moment. Ethan's eyes scanned the interior. The pews were overturned, the altar a crumbled mess of broken wood and rotting fabric. Stained glass windows, now shattered, lined the walls, casting distorted patches of color onto the floor. But it was the silence that unsettled him most. The church should have been teeming with the low growls of infected, drawn by the scent of life. But there was nothing. "There's nothing here," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would trigger something. "Why would they leave it so empty?" "That's what I'm worried about," Ethan replied, his own voice tight with unease. His fingers hovered over the worn handle of his knife, though he didn't know what he expected to encounter. The infected weren't known for their restraint, and there was no way they would pass up the opportunity to feed on fresh meat. So why wasn't anything coming for them? Before they could discuss further, a noise pierced the stillness, a soft scuffing sound, like feet dragging against the floor. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a chill through Ethan's spine. The sound didn't come from any of them. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the church. "Stay close," Ethan ordered, his voice sharp. They moved forward, careful and deliberate, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by the vast emptiness of the building. The church's interior seemed to stretch forever, every corner obscured in darkness. They made their way down a narrow aisle toward the stairs that led beneath the church, where the crypts and storage rooms once lay. Ethan's instincts were telling him they needed to leave, but there was something else, a pull in his gut urging him to go down, to find out what was lurking beneath the surface. As they reached the stairs, the dragging sound grew louder, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, but he pressed on, determined to discover the source. They descended into the crypt, where the air was thick with mildew and dampness. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, the stone floor slick with moisture. The crypt was old, its walls lined with stone caskets long forgotten. The faint, distant light of their flashlights caught the edges of strange markings, symbols carved into the walls, worn and aged, but still eerily distinct. "This place doesn't feel right," Sarah said, her voice low and strained. Ethan nodded, but before he could respond, a soft sound echoed from one of the far corners, a whisper, almost like a voice, too faint to understand. "Did you hear that?" Daniel asked, his hand trembling slightly as he held his rifle close. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if it was calling to them. "You should have stayed away." Ethan's blood ran cold. That voice, he knew it. He didn't know how, but he recognized it, as if it had been planted somewhere deep in his memory. It was familiar but twisted, as if it had been distorted by time or something darker. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "We're not alone," Ethan murmured. In a sudden movement, Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. She pointed ahead, her face pale. At the far end of the crypt stood a figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness. Its features were impossible to make out, a shadow among shadows, but its presence was undeniable. It was watching them. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and for a split second, everything felt wrong, like the entire world was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It was fast, too fast for a human, darting toward them in a blur. The next thing Ethan knew, the floor beneath his feet was gone. Darkness swallowed him whole. Ethan hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him as he tumbled into the cold, damp stone floor of the crypt. He could hear the panicked sounds of Sarah and Daniel hitting the ground beside him, their cries of surprise and shock echoing in the vast, claustrophobic space. The dark figure had vanished as quickly as it appeared, but its presence lingered in the air, something ancient and malevolent. "Ethan!" Sarah's voice came through the ringing in his ears. She was already up, her hands reaching to help him to his feet. What the hell was that? He didn't have an answer. He scrambled to stand, his muscles stiff and his heart racing. The air felt heavier now, the oppressive silence surrounding them more suffocating. The whispering voice that had spoken earlier, was it from the figure? Or something else entirely? Ethan didn't know, but he was sure that whatever it wasn't something they could fight with guns or knives. "Where did it go?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky as he scanned the dark corners of the crypt with wide eyes. "It was here. I swear." Ethan glanced around, his instincts telling him to stay alert, to move fast. He pulled his flashlight from his belt, its beam trembling in his hand as he cast it across the stone walls. The symbols etched into the surfaces seemed to twist in the pale light, shifting like living things. The crypt had always been a place of death and remembrance, but this felt different. The very air seemed to hum with an energy that was unnatural, alive with something they could not comprehend. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice low but urgent. She was already moving toward the stairs, her rifle raised and ready. "Now." Ethan hesitated. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was growing stronger by the second. He couldn't shake the thought that they were no longer in control of their fate. The crypt had become a trap, and whatever lay within it, whatever had watched them from the shadows, was toying with them. It wanted them to move, to act impulsively. But there was no going back. "We have to find out what's down here," Ethan said, his voice determined. He couldn't leave without answers. He couldn't leave until they knew what had taken their world, and what might still be lurking in the darkness, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Sarah's face tightened, her eyes flashing with frustration and fear. "Ethan, we're not heroes. We don't need to play the saviors of the world. We need to get out before whatever that thing is decides to finish us off." He looked at her, his chest tightening. He knew she was right. They weren't in control anymore. But there was something gnawing at him, something buried deep inside that told him they couldn't just leave without confronting whatever this was. "I can't just walk away," he said quietly, his gaze flickering to the walls again. "There's something here. Something worse than the infected. We're not just surviving anymore. This place is alive. And it's been waiting for us." Before Sarah could protest further, a sudden sound broke the tension, a low, grinding noise, like stone scraping against stone. Ethan spun around just in time to see one of the stone slabs in the crypt shift. The dark figure was reappearing, but this time, it wasn't alone. From the shadows, more figures emerged, shapeless, grotesque forms, their bodies moving with unnatural jerks. They were not infected. Not in the traditional sense. The air around Ethan seemed to crackle with an eerie energy as the figures drew closer, their faces obscured by darkness, their movements unnervingly quick. They didn't moan, they didn't lunge, they just watched, their hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. Ethan's heart raced as the realization hit him: they were not the infected. These things were something different. Something far worse. And they had been waiting for them. "Run," Sarah hissed, her voice a mere whisper, but it carried the weight of desperation. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. Daniel was right behind them, moving with a speed he hadn't thought possible for someone so cautious. They had to get out. But even as they bolted for the exit, Ethan could feel the presence of the figures closing in, their eyes following every step, every move they made. As they reached the top of the stairs, the crypt door slammed shut behind them with an almost deafening bang. The shadows were closing in. There was no way out. They had to face whatever was waiting for them. The door to the crypt slammed shut behind them with an unsettling finality. The walls of the church seemed to press in from every side, as if the very structure of the building was alive, moving in response to the dark presence beneath it. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and he could hear the frantic breath of Sarah and Daniel as they ran through the narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing like a countdown to something horrible. "We can't outrun them," Daniel gasped, glancing over his shoulder. The figures from the crypt were following them, no longer mere shadows, but distinct shapes, moving faster than anything human should be capable of. Their limbs jerked at strange angles, like they were puppets on twisted strings. There was something about them, something off about their movements, that made Ethan's stomach churn. "We don't have a choice," Ethan said, his voice grating as they turned a corner toward the back exit of the church. The wooden doors that led out to the alley were just ahead, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was coming for them wasn't bound by doors or walls. It would follow them, hunt them, until there was nowhere left to run. "Keep moving," Sarah barked, pushing forward as they reached the doors. She slammed her shoulder into the heavy wood, trying to force it open. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door didn't budge. "They're locked," Daniel cried out, panic creeping into his voice. The figures from the crypt were closer now, their shapes more defined in the dim light, though their faces remained obscured. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. "Get back!" Ethan shouted, shoving Daniel aside. He rushed forward, grabbing the metal crossbar that secured the door and ripping it off with a grunt of effort. It was old, rusted, but still solid. The moment he yanked it free, the door creaked open. The cold night air rushed in, a fleeting breath of freedom. But as Ethan turned to push the door fully open, something froze him in place. A voice, low, smooth, like a whisper that reverberated inside his skull, spoke from behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan spun around, his pulse racing. The figures from the crypt were standing at the threshold of the room, their eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. They weren't just mindless creatures, they were intelligent, and they were in control. The voice came again, this time clearer, with a chilling finality. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan's eyes widened. The shadowy figures were no longer just predators. They were something else. They weren't from this world, or they were from a version of it far darker, far older. "You know who we are," the voice continued, and this time, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the air, the very ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with the presence of something vast and terrible. "You know what we've done to your world." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The infection had come from somewhere, he knew that, but this wasn't the same. These figures, this presence, it was as if the very foundation of reality was bending around them. "No," he said, shaking his head. This is just a nightmare. It can't be real." One of the figures stepped forward, its body rippling with dark energy, its form shifting unnaturally. It raised a hand, and the air crackled. Ethan stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figure spoke again, its voice now more tangible, more present in the air around them. The infection was only the beginning. It was the awakening. "You, Ethan Williams, and your companions are merely pawns in a game far larger than you understand." Sarah's rifle trembled in her hands, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? What game?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it extended its hand toward them. "You have the choice now. You can join us, become part of what's coming, or you can continue to fight for a dying world. The choice is yours, but make it quickly." Ethan could feel the weight of the words press against him, each one like a stone sinking into his chest. This wasn't just about survival. This was something far worse, far more dangerous. The infection, the horrors they had been running from, it was all part of something much darker. And they had walked right into its grasp. "We're not choosing you," Ethan spat, his voice raw with defiance. "Whatever you are, whatever this is, we're not going down without a fight." A low, mocking laugh echoed through the church, but the figure simply nodded, as if it had expected the response. "Very well. You will fight, but you will not win. Not this time." With a sudden, fluid motion, the figure raised both hands, and the air around them thickened, pulsating with dark energy. The shadows in the room twisted and contorted, growing longer, darker. Ethan's body felt heavy, as though the very gravity of the space was changing, pulling him downward. He fought the sensation, but it was like wading through tar. His limbs felt sluggish, his vision darkening. "We'll see you soon," the voice whispered, before the world around them splintered into blackness. And then, everything went quiet. Ethan awoke to silence. His body felt heavy, as though he were encased in thick mud, but there was no time to lie still. His senses exploded to life as the air around him crackled with a dark, oppressive energy. He was on the ground, but his head throbbed with a sharp, painful clarity, the remnants of the figure's attack still lingering in his bones. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to survive. He forced his eyes open, blinking rapidly to clear the fog from his vision. The church was still there, at least, the remnants of it. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagging in places as if it had been weathered by time and something far worse. Shadows still flickered in every corner, and the floor beneath him was cold, wet with an unknown substance. But there was no sign of the figures. No sign of the twisted creatures that had hunted them. "Ethan." Sarah's voice cut through the haze, harsh and panicked. "Ethan, are you alive?" He pushed himself up, grimacing as pain shot through his limbs. He had no idea how much time had passed, but the overwhelming sense of dread in the air told him it hadn't been long. They weren't alone, and whatever was coming was worse than before. "I'm here," Ethan muttered, his throat dry. He looked around, spotting Sarah and Daniel not far from him, both equally disoriented but alive. Their weapons were still in hand, though the sense of hopelessness was clear in their eyes. "What happened?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. He wiped his forehead, glancing nervously around the room. It was like we were suffocating." "What the hell was that thing?" Ethan shook his head, struggling to put the pieces together. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not over. We're still in the middle of whatever game they're playing." A chill ran through him as he recalled the words of the figure, the choice between joining them or fighting. It had been a cruel offer, an impossible one. But deep down, Ethan knew that choosing to fight was the only option. It had to be. "We can't give up," Sarah said, her voice low but resolute. "If we do, then we've already lost." Ethan nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. "We need to find a way to stop them, whatever they are. We've been surviving this long, we can't just let it end here." But as the words left his mouth, a sound echoed through the ruined church, slow, rhythmic footsteps, like a heavy presence drawing closer with every step. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the grip of his weapon, his heart racing. He turned, the dread in his stomach sinking deeper. The shadows at the far end of the room began to shift, coalescing into something far darker, far more sinister than the figures they had encountered before. The very air felt thick with darkness, as if it were alive, writhing and pulsating, feeding off their fear. And then, from the depths of the shadow, it emerged. The figure was tall, almost impossibly so, its limbs long and sinewy, moving with an unnatural grace. Its face was hidden behind a veil of darkness, but its glowing eyes pierced the gloom, cold and unblinking. It wasn't just one of the twisted creatures they'd seen before, it was something greater, a manifestation of the very nightmare they had been fighting against. "You should have listened," the figure said, its voice a terrible, guttural rasp, filled with disdain. "This world is ours now." Ethan's blood ran cold. The fight, the survival, it wasn't just for their lives anymore. It was for the world, for humanity itself. They had unwittingly stepped into a war they couldn't understand. Sarah stepped forward, her rifle aimed at the figure, her hand steady despite the terror flooding through her. "We'll never bow to you," she declared, her voice hard with defiance. The figure's laugh was low, like a rumble of thunder, but it did not move. "You cannot win. This world was never meant to survive." Ethan tightened his grip on his weapon. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he knew they had to fight. With everything they had. "Then we'll fight until we have nothing left," he said, his voice determined. The figure before them was powerful, but they still had their will. And as long as they had that, they had a chance. Sarah raised her rifle, her aim precise. For the future. For everyone still out there. Without another word, the battle began. The first shot rang out, echoing through the ruins of the church. The creature staggered back, its form flickering as if the shot had disrupted its unnatural existence. But it was far from finished. Ethan's mind raced, trying to think of a way to defeat it. Their bullets, their knives, nothing had worked before. This thing was different. But as the fight raged on, with every shot and every swing, Ethan realized something: the figure wasn't just attacking them. It was toying with them, testing their resolve. And that was their chance. With a roar, Ethan lunged forward, driving his blade into the dark energy swirling around the creature. It screamed in pain, its form flickering and cracking like glass. For the first time, it seemed vulnerable. "Now!" Ethan shouted to Sarah and Daniel. Together, they pressed forward. They didn't have much time, but as the figure shrieked in fury, its dark form began to shatter. The fight wasn't over, but this was their moment. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan believed they might just win.